Welcome to Stand With Us TV Live. Stand With Us is working around the clock, supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism. Thank you for joining us. Great show for you today. Coming up, I'll be joined by Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, who was born in Egypt and was later imprisoned for studying Hebrew. He is a self-described reclusive internet nerd who is also obsessed with comic books. While growing up in Egypt, the ultimate villains in his eyes were the bloodthirsty Zionists. This led him to study the Zionist enemies. During his Hebrew studies at Cairo University, he struggled to connect with the curriculum, which was full of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic ideas. Persecuted by the Egyptian state police for daring to study about Israel, he was monitored, harassed, and jailed. He was also suspected of being a Zionist agent and was held in a military detention facility where he was tortured. Disowned by his family because of his love for Israel, Hussein has suffered through many difficulties and is here to share his incredible journey with us. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Hussein Aboubakr. Welcome, Hussein.
Thank you, Roz.
We are so happy. We're so happy to have you with us again. And you'll keep coming back because you're such an amazing guest.
Thank you.
Hussein, tell us a little bit about your life journey. Start a little bit from the beginning. You grew up with anti-Semitism all around you. Could you tell us about that?
Definitely. I was born in 1989 in Cairo, in Egypt, and I had a very normal upbringing by Egyptian standards. To Cairo middle-class family. And I received the primary education and socialization that any child in these circumstances would receive, and that's including learning the basic identity narrative, the basic history, and just being socialized into the culture in general. And a lot of that included a lot of great and beautiful things that I still carry with me till today. But it also included a very troubling part that was extremely anti-Semitic, extremely hostile to Jews, to Israel, that basically considered them the epitome of evil itself. Jews were completely dehumanized and demonized in cartoons, on TV shows, by teachers in the school. That was just something that everybody believed in, and you were not even aware of it because it was just completely normal. It was part of the kind of the order of the universe that the Jews are evil, and that was the narrative that everybody believed in sincerely. Maybe people just carried on their lives normally, but it was always kind of a fact that Jews are evil. And after 9/11, a lot of things were going on, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the Second Intifada. And that started a wave of radicalization and radical rhetoric in mosques, on TV, on Al Jazeera, that unfortunately radicalized an entire generation of which I was a part. In 2002, there was a major TV show produced by the Egyptian TV that year about the Protocols of Zion, and it was aired in the holy month of Ramadan. That's the primary TV show season, about the evil Jewish plan for world domination. And just the anti-Semitic indoctrination kind of accelerated. And I was a part of that. And it took me a very long time to really re-educate myself out of this hatred and start looking at the world very differently and rehumanize or humanize Jews in my own understanding. And with that, even humanizing myself.
What was the moment that made you think that there was something wrong with the upbringing? In other words, how did you get to be different than everybody around you and everything around you? All that input, and suddenly you feel like, wait a minute, maybe it's not true. I mean, what was that? What happened to you?
It was a long and truly painful process. It's really it's hard for people to imagine how difficult it is, because anti-Semitism, unfortunately and sadly, and this is something that we need to take seriously and deal with, became a component of the identity structure in the Middle East, in Arab and Muslim societies in the 20th century. So to get rid of that part, that means that you will have to undertake a process of restructuring your identity, which is an extremely difficult process and very few people of any background really undertake. I was really obsessed with the anti-Semitism. I really believed in it. I believed that Jews are evil, and it was a fascinating reality to me. It was like living in Lord of the Rings, where there are those, orcs and super villains that I can fight. And my obsession led me actually to go to online on the internet and teach myself Hebrew in order to know more about those very evil people. And through learning Hebrew, I started reading and learning things about Israel. I started learning things about the Jewish people, about Jewish history. And slowly, I started to realize that reality might be very, very different than what I thought. But if I have to point at one thing that kind of was truly a watershed moment, was when I actually looked closely at the Israeli culture, or the cultural productions that I was examining, whether online videos or articles, and discovered that the level of demonization and dehumanization that exists for Jews in Arab societies is completely absent from Israeli rhetoric when it comes to Arabs. That is, that Israel might be engaged in conflicts with Palestinians or other Arab countries, but it never really devolves into the level of neurotic dehumanization that I grew up with. And I remember this comparison really shook me morally, because it was an obvious moral gap that you cannot reconcile by any kind of clever mental or cognitive trick that I take. I remember, for example, and this may be one last example, when I started seeing content that was produced by Shalom Achshav. Now, Shalom Achshav is a very far-left anti-Zionist organization that produces content that's very sympathetic to the Palestinians and anti-Israeli in a lot of ways. And I remember the first time I got exposed to that, I was shocked to find that you could be an Israeli and could openly say things that are anti-Israel, something that I know that couldn't happen in my own society. You can't be anti-Arab and pro-Israel, or the consequences will be dire. So the presence of those voices taught me further that there is a huge moral gap.
And you told me recently about a book that somebody gave to you. You want to show that book to us and tell us a little bit about it?
Definitely. It's actually a friend of mine actually was on a trip to Egypt recently. And I gave him, I told him to buy me some books from just go to the books. I literally told him, go to the bookstore and ask for what people read, like buy from me. I gave him like $100. I told him, like, I want to know what people are reading. And one of the things he brought me was this book, which is called The Peace of Blood, Salam al-Dam. And as you can see already, you have all Israeli political leaders with their arms dripped in blood. So this book is a condemnation of peace with Israel. And it's a collection of basically very anti-Semitic cartoons from across the years to condemn having peace with Israel, because Israelis are bloodthirsty, and just the kind of perpetuation of the neurotic blood libel. And it's really sad that even till today, this kind of content is produced and consumed in Egypt.
I remember hearing that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a best-selling book in Egypt and in other Arab countries. It makes me very sad. Is that still true?
It is. It's Unfortunately, I think it will take a long time till we actually get rid of the legacy of anti-Semitism, including the Protocol of Zion. So unfortunately, the Protocol of Zion is indeed popular. I remember in Egypt, it was literally sold, in every stand that sells newspapers on a street corner. There were some staples that they would carry: Mein Kampf, the Protocol of Zion, and so on, and a few other books. And unfortunately, I was in Morocco in 2019. I remember also going to a bookstore, and I saw several copies and various translations of Mein Kampf and the Protocols of Zion. So unfortunately, they are still there. Now, the level of popularity, given also that the Middle East is going through some major social transformations, we can't really tell for sure. That is, how many people actually read this.
So, Hussein, I know that you felt alone at the time that you were going through all this change, and you've told me about that. And we also know that you wrote a book called Minority of One. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Sure. I wrote Minority of One about 2 years ago in order to tell my story and tell my journey through the process of just freeing my mind, deconstructing and reconstructing my identity, and struggling with a lot of personal and inner conflict and cultural conflict with big questions, really. Who am I? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to believe? Where is the truth? And these are very important questions in the lives of every one of us. And when you are in a situation that really constricts your ability, whether to receive information, to ask questions, to talk openly about those things, then you have to do all of this process internally, and that kind of puts you in a place of loneliness that's extremely hard to deal with. So basically, I'm exploring that personal journey, but not just that. I'm trying to achieve several things through that book. One of them is also to tell my story and growing up through the 90s and the 2000s in Egypt until the Arab Spring and until I left in 2012, and try through my story to shed the light on some of the major transformations that were happening in the Middle East and in Egyptian society specifically throughout this era, through the various influences and cultural currents, whether the rising tide of Islamism since the Iranian Revolution that really culminated into the Arab Spring, or the Western influences of consumerism and other ideas. So I'm trying to explore also these things. And one of the other main goals that I have is to actually tell my story in a way that also humanizes these societies. When we talk about problems of racism or anti-Semitism, which are very extremely important problems that every society has to have the courage and the honesty to deal with, it's very dangerous to fall into a place of defensiveness or kind of Manichaean polar view of black and white of the world. And I wanted to tell my story in a way that also humanizes and keeps the humanity of this society, that anti-Semitism is a human problem. It's a problem in a human society of bad ideas, of wrong ideas. And individuals have agency, and they also have very complicated circumstances, whether social, cultural, political, that limits their abilities and provides opportunities to do different things. And we have to understand any society within those very different elements that affects its behavior. So I tried to humanize also Middle Eastern, Arab, and Muslim societies specifically.
Well, nothing is ever black and white. And so thank you for, making that point. And I do encourage people to get the book and read the book. You'll love it. And you also did a film, right? We did a film together, documentary about you and about this whole story of yours, which is incredible. Let's talk about how similar the life that you grew up in the anti-Semitism that you were surrounded by. Let's talk about how similar that is to the other Arab countries. Do you know?
That's an extremely good question. And here I'm going to try not to get too technical. But this is also something of a personal and professional interest in understanding that place that we roughly call the Arab world. In my opinion, we still do not have, that is, whether in public discourse here in the United States or even in the most informed scholarly circle, I'm sad to say that we still don't have an adequate mapping of the different problems in different societies in the Arab world. And we usually tend to use that blanket term Arabs to talk about societies that are actually quite different. They are similar in ways, but they are different in so many ways. And there are similarities and there are differences. There are continuities and there are changes. And we still didn't figure out exactly how to talk about that whole thing in a more concise and analytical language. Arab societies are facing different challenges. They are at different stages of development. And the circumstances, economic, political, and social, are quite asymmetric between countries. That is, the conditions and the historical conditions in Egypt are different than those of Lebanon, are different than those of Morocco, are different than those of Saudi Arabia. Economy, of course, plays a major role, just the level of economic mobility, the level of economic development in each country. But I can tell you that from my own observations and my own research, there are certain things that we can assert for sure. Countries that were directly affected by the ideology of Arab nationalism in the post-colonial era, they do have things in common than countries that did not follow the path of Arab nationalism. And roughly, we can make that distinction based on the form of governance, whether it's republican or monarchical. So you will see that Arab monarchies that usually, with the exception of Jordan, that didn't really engage with Arab nationalism in the 50s and the 60s, still the beginning of the 70s, they do have different social conditions and different behavior than countries that did engage with those things. From my own research, I can tell that even the issue of anti-Semitism is different based on that. So the anti-Semitism of the Protocols of Zion and the Nazi adaptation and the Arab adaptation of European classical anti-Semitism is much more prevalent in societies that modernized and had the large influence of Arab nationalism. That would be Egypt, that would be the Palestinians, that would be the Syrians, that would be the Iraqis, the Algerians. Countries that did not follow that path, so they kept a traditional monarchy, that's Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf, the kind of anti-Semitism that they suffered from was kind of a traditional religious prejudice anti-Semitism that's based on the idea of following the right or the wrong religion. And from my experience, this last form of anti-Semitism is actually might be easier to deal with, despite that people might think otherwise. And I think the Abraham Accords will believe that. So in short, I just want to say that Arab societies are at different stages. They are at different points, developmentally, economically, socially, politically, and it's really hard to make generalizations about them. There are some generalizations that we can make, but those are very limited, and they don't really express a lot of the other diversity.
Thank you. I mean, you mentioned it, so why don't we dive right into talking about it? The Abraham Accords and how it might have an impact, hopefully, on everything we're looking at with all this anti-Semitism that has been, quite prevalent in Egypt with the Palestinians, and, Jew and Israel are synonymous, and, it's bad, it's evil, you got to get rid of it. How is the Abraham Accords, how is that helpful, and in what ways? And do you think it will spread? I have a million questions about this, but what is your sort of general feeling about this?
I'm very happy about the Abraham Accords, and I think everybody should be. The Abraham Accords is a historical step, really, in the history of the Middle East. And first of all, let's say that, people in general, we have a problem historically, everybody, in dealing with time and understanding change. And that's one of the biggest philosophical and social and even personal challenges that each person has in their life, is dealing with the fact that things change. What you have today, you don't have tomorrow. The person that you are today is not the person that you were yesterday. So the Middle East also does change, and Arab societies do change, maybe in ways that we can't fully comprehend, and maybe at a pace that's very different than what we imagined, but they do change. The Abraham Accords is a sign that there is a massive social transformation that's been going on in the Middle East in certain societies, primarily in the Gulf societies, that they are starting to construct a different identity, they're starting to develop a different concept of identity than the one that was prevalent in the Middle East in the last century and the first 2 decades of this century. And that is those concepts of or identity were directly tied to either pan-Arabism or pan-Islamic identity or other form of kind of chauvinist regional nationalisms. Here you have the Arab Gulf that is as a very different stage of development. I mean, we know for a fact that the GCC countries or the Gulf countries, they don't suffer from the economic problems that Egypt or Sudan or Lebanon might be suffering from. They also have a very different social structure that is based more or less on a tribal ethos. And tribal here, I'm not using pejoratively. I'm just as a matter of fact. And they're also developing new national identities. The Emirates did not exist prior to the 1970s. It's a brand new country. It's a brand new identity. And it has a lot of confidence because the Emirates is a successful country economically. It actually is a major attraction for a lot of young Arabs from all over the Middle East to go seek their fortunes there. And that kind of success, I think, provided countries in the Gulf with a new self-confidence that is able to give them leverage to take decisions that are hard for other people to take. Mainly, what is it that they want to be, and how do they imagine their own country and in relations to other country. And the Abraham Accords is a part of that. It's the assertiveness of their sovereignty, of their independent decision, and also their signaling that they would like to move away from the legacy of the 20th century Arab politics, which included so many civil wars, factionalism, destructions, wars with Israel, the lack of the economic collapse, and a lot of other destructive events that kind of came consecutively across the region. So I've been actually talking with a lot of people from the Arab Gulf, and I'm actually shocked that they do have a vision that is very different than what the Middle East used to be for themselves. And that's something that should make all of us really hopeful. And hopefully this vision, as it succeeds, it will actually start convincing other people in other countries that this is what they need to do as well. So there is a lot of hopes that this will lead to better conditions in the region in general.
Well, your optimism about this, I'm sure, is giving people listening a lot of optimism. If you were unsure, what you're hearing and what you get from many of these people who live there is a sense of, we want change. We want something new. We want something fresh. The Arab Spring really didn't do it. And this is really maybe the Arab Spring. This could be the real Arab Spring.
Right.
So how do you think that Iran is watching this and thinking about it?
Iran is definitely one of the primary threats for this new vision. So the fact that I talk now with optimism and said there are real Arabs, real people on the ground who have a really good new vision. And those people, for the first time, have money and power behind them. I mean, this is a great, unprecedented thing in the modern history of the Middle East. People who usually had good opinions had to leave. So the fact that today you have people who have a good vision and they actually have state power behind them is just is really a cause for jubilation. But that doesn't mean that there are no challenges or that this is guaranteed to succeed. And you asked about Iran, and Iran is a first and foremost challenge for this actually to happen. The Islamic Republic of Iran, or the Islamic regime, since its rise in 1979, it started actually a wave of transformation, social and political transformation all across the region. That is, that we can actually point a direct line between the rise of the forces of political Islam or across the Middle East and the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And this is not just arbitrary. I think there are a lot of evidence to support this. Even Israel, in its wars with the Arabs in the 70s and the 60s, it was usually a secular war. Religion didn't play a big role in it. If you those who know history, or even maybe remember some of the events from those days, a lot of the factions or the Palestinian terrorist groups like the PLFB and so on, they were actually very Marxist, communist factions that were directly tied to the USSR. The Islamization of all forms of conflict and the rapid Islamization of societies in the Middle East started at its earnest in 1979. So Iran directly is tied with a project, a cultural, political, hegemonic project in the Middle East for the rise of the extremely politicized form of the Islamic identity with a predatory political paradigm. And one of the things that Iran has been using, or their main truly mobilization tool, is their anti-Semitism, their hatred towards Israel, and their adoption of the Palestinian cause. They want to make themselves now the carrier of the banner of Palestine and honor and Islam and all of those great abstractions. And this is what they have been doing. They have formed what's known as the axis of resistance. And of course, resistance here means resistance towards Israel and the United States. And by doing that, basically Iran is appropriating all of the legacy of anti-Semitism, wars with Israel, hatred towards the United States. And that's a very diverse legacy. It's religious, it's secular, it's Nasser, it's Soviet propaganda. Iran is trying to really appropriate all of that and use it in order to establish itself as a hegemonic power. So rapprochement between Israel and the Arabs is the last thing that Iran wants to see, because it threatens all of its project. And this is why they have been they and their and other Islamist entities, the Muslim Brotherhood, have been actually engaged in a vicious propaganda campaign against the countries that signed the peace treaty with Israel, namely the Arab Gulf, and as well as Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is known to have give its support to the Abraham Accords.
So we hope the time is now, really, that this is going to flourish, but the odds, if you leave it to Iran, are certainly against peace. But we see, people to people, we see beautiful things emerging. A flight came in from Morocco yesterday for the first time into Israel. And so, we're hopeful that the good will outweigh the bad, and that the monsters will go away. We have so many questions coming in, Hussein, and one of them is from Elliot in Seattle. I think they know that you're a student now also, in addition to being a professional educator for Stand With Us. We know that you're a student now, and I think you're in Middle East Studies, but you can tell us about that. But his question is, what are you seeing in Middle East Studies, and what advice do you have for students that are in Middle East Studies, seeing a bit of what you're seeing? I think he's describing all that.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I'm currently a graduate student at George Washington University, getting a degree specializing in international affairs in the Middle East, specifically. And honestly, the situation in academia, I'm an avid consumer of academic literature. I think things are worse than people think in academia. That is, in terms of the bias against Israel, in terms of what I think is a complete misunderstanding of the Middle East, of Arab countries, and of Islam as a human phenomena in general. Unfortunately, a lot of the students reach those departments without really developing the ability to have a critical distance between themselves and whatever they are learning. And if anybody has any scholarly or academic, actually any person in general, needs to develop the skill to maintain a critical distance between themselves and everything that they hear or everything that they read. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing that among the majority of students. and they accept many times unquestioningly or uncritically a lot of what's being said about Israel and the Middle East. I have a lot of stories of frustration about what happens in academia, especially in Middle East department. But I can summarize it to say that the anti-Israel position is now nearly a consensus in academia. That is specifically political science, the area that I'm studying. There is almost a consensus, and this was actually demonstrated by a survey that was conducted by Mark Lynch, who's also a professor at my university, and he's one of the foremost known experts on the Middle East in the country. He actually conducted a survey of scholars of the Middle East all across the country, or almost 3,000 scholars of the Middle East, and about maybe 67% of them said that either Israel is an apartheid state or it's very close to being an apartheid state. That's 67%. And if you go into academia, you will see that this has clear and direct meaning in what's being taught, on the literature that's being written, even when it has nothing to do with Israel. And they can give an example of how this happens, that this is becoming a consensus. This is not even being discussed anymore. Let's say that you are studying development in developing country. That is, you're some sort of a student who's interested to go work for the World Bank, for a UN relief institution, just development, Africa, South America. And maybe you're studying you're taking a certain class about obstacles to development, things that will be hard for people to go develop. And a chapter might be called that occupations or military activity, that many times in order to go to a poor area and develop, you have to deal with the obstacle of having brutal occupation forces, for example, Israel. Here you have a big body of academic literature that has nothing to do with Israel. It talks about an abstract theoretical issue of development and obstacles in development work. And just the examples will be given about terrible, bad Israel. This is extremely common in political science and in Middle Eastern studies. That, as I said, it's becoming a consensus, and it's quite alarming.
So if that's the case, Hussein, and you're seeing it firsthand, what is your advice to students? Besides knowing that there's this consensus and they may be, experiencing it and they shouldn't think they're crazy. Besides that, what are you advising them?
First of all, I advise that this is time for hard work. You will have to make sacrifices. There is no other way. Good things happen only through sacrifices. You'll have to sacrifice time, you'll have to sacrifice effort, and you'll have to sacrifice comfort. And from my experience, the sacrifice is actually worth it. The students will have to engage. They will have to sharpen their own analytical tools. They will have to reach beyond what's being offered to them. They will have to talk together, make groups, and they will have to challenge those assumptions. What we need, I'm saying this not to scare people from going to academia, not to scare Jewish families from sending their children to the universities. I actually want Jewish families to send their kids in the universities, hopefully after they have given them a strong Jewish and Zionist education. And those students will have to engage actively and challenge those paradigms that I know for a fact they are wrong. They are not based on objective or empirical data. They are based on extremely sketchy political science theories at best. And from my own experience, it's actually easily doable to poke into all of those very inflated balloons of lies that have just been accepted into academia. So the students it's time for work. It's time to get in there, start to sharpen your skills, and it's time to make your voice heard and to challenge this.
It would be really helpful, Hussein, if you put these things into categories as much as possible for students to be able to pick up a category like you and I talked about colonization.
Right.
Why the whole premise of everything is based on colonization is not accurate. Why? And present, a few bullet points to them. You're saying that they should do research, they should prepare to do work and not be afraid and to engage.
Right.
But, where do they begin? And you're looking at it and you know all the arguments and you're a professional and you're able to do this. Maybe you could take the time to put together these categories of misinformation that is now becoming consensus because it's emotional for people, to make it the consensus. It's manipulative to make it the consensus, that maybe you break it into categories and give students some bullet points that they can even think about or be critical about when they're hearing all this stuff. What do you think?
I agree. It's something definitely that I'm planning to do. There are a lot of things that needs to be addressed. And my advice to people, you have to understand that the issue of Israel cannot be isolated. And I say this very sincerely, from a lot of other major theoretical, political, and moral questions that are being discussed in academia. And one of them, as you just mentioned, Roz, is the legacy of colonialism in the Middle East. You just can't isolate Israel and try to talk about it, because basically the theoretical ground on which the conversations happens, as I said, is deeply flawed. And some work has already been done with major scholars. For example, Edward Said books that really initiated the entire discipline of post-colonial studies has been refuted by some actually good scholars of Middle Eastern studies, including the monumental work of Bernard Lewis. However, a lot of this didn't gain traction, and I think a lot of people do feel a position. There is also an element of moral intimidation that happens, that people are forced to pay lip service into things they don't even know, they are not sure about, or don't truly believe in. And this is why this also requires moral courage. That is, you can't simply be intimidated in sounding those positions. But I definitely plan to work on a lot of these issues to help create some new tools to deal with them. But if any person has any interest in these issues, any student, I work with StandWithUs. Please email me. I will respond to you. I will help you. I will discuss those things with you.
That is what is so wonderful about you and about the resources that Stand With Us, because we want to be there. We want to be your partner out there and help you through these challenges, these conversations that are difficult sometimes. On a lighter note, we have a question from Samantha in New York, who knows that you're a Hebrew teacher, or have been a Hebrew teacher, and wanted to know, what's your favorite Hebrew catchphrase?
Oh wow, that's a difficult one. There are a lot of good Hebrew phrases that I like. I like Chaval al Azman, which means kind of amazing, but it doesn't. If you know what it means like what a waste of time. But then you actually use it very positively. So I like that phrase, and I actually encourage people to learn Hebrew. Please learn Hebrew. Hebrew changed my life to the better, and I have no doubt that it can also make a very positive contribution to people's lives. So I hope that more people here in the U.S. start taking Hebrew classes.
That's good advice. Yes, learn to speak Hebrew, and I'll add, learn to speak Yiddish. Yiddish was my first language, Hussein, and it's such a cool language also. But between the two, you don't need too much else. Maybe Arabic.
Arabic would be definitely a very useful addition.
Yes, especially after all that we're talking about in Middle Eastern studies. Hussein, it is such a pleasure to be with you again and again. One final question for you. If you wanted to communicate something to all of our listeners, based on all the work that you do, based on all the education that you do, that you're reading and everything, do you have a message for us?
I do have a message. It's not, I don't want it to sound very alarmist, but there are alarming changes that are happening in the United States, whether culturally or politically, when it comes specifically to the issue of anti-Semitism and Israel. And those things need to be confronted now. We've seen recently with the wave of anti-Semitism that broke out during the war between Hamas and Israel, and the rockets that Hamas fired indiscriminately against Israeli civilians. We saw how big the problem is in the United States. This problem is not going away, and if it's not dealt with sincerely and head on, it will only get worse. And it's time to move for the Jewish community in the United States and the Zionist community and all of those who are, I'm not Jewish, all of those who are interested in confronting that monster that's called anti-Semitism, they need to come together now, and we need to start formulating a strategy on systematically dealing with anti-Semitism, not just on campuses and Middle Eastern Studies department, but also in our educational system, in our media, in our entertainment, in our political system, because otherwise the problem will only start getting bigger. Another thing is that education or identity can no longer be taken for granted. You have to educate your kids. You have to send your kids to get a proper education for them to have a strong sense of identity and to be able to withstand the current cultural pressure that is exerted especially on young people. You can't expect your children to grow up believing in the values that you believe in. You have to actually actively teach them. You have to send them to educational programs. So this is a time to be proactive and to come together. And from my own personal experience, I know that really educating people is possible. I know that fighting anti-Semitism, one person at the time, is completely possible. But the only tool to do this is to actually be engaged in an actual educational journey for yourself and for others.
Wow. So you just reviewed the priorities of Stand With Us, our actual mission statement to educate and inspire people about Israel and to fight anti-Semitism. And so thank you from me personally for living it and believing in it and being so true to yourself and so helpful to Israel and to the Jewish people. We really, really adore you, Hussein, in so many different ways and are appreciative beyond words that I can say. So thank you so much, Hussein, for being with us again. And the next time we expect you to play that instrument behind you.
Hopefully I would have learned by then.
Well, it looks good, right? It looks good.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
In 2 weeks, we have another terrific show for you. We'll be joined by T.M. Garrett, a former neo-Nazi and KKK leader who left hate groups and extremist ideology behind in 2002 and is now a motivational speaker and German-American human rights and interfaith activist. Don't forget, we're live here every second Sunday. If you've missed any of today's show or any of our previous interviews with Ambassador Michael Oren, Sherry Rogers, Ambassador Danny Danon, or many others, go to StandWithUs.tv, where you'll find a host of great video content available at no cost around the clock. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Shalom from Stand With Us.